You're listening to Beyond the Endpoint, a podcast from the Duke Clinical Research Institute. In this series, we're demystifying clinical research and answering your pressing questions about health and healthcare. You can find our full episodes at dcri.org/BTE.
By 2030, some analysts predict the GLP-1 market could surpass $100 billion. With expanding applications, new formulations, and advances in combination therapies, the possibilities for these drugs seem almost limitless, and they have the potential to transform health across a wide spectrum. But as we discussed in our last episode, access remains a major challenge. Between affordability issues and overwhelming demand, navigating the space can feel like the Wild West. I'm Dr. Emily O'Brien, a population health researcher at the Duke Clinical Research Institute. I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Manesh Patel, head of cardiology at Duke Medicine and a faculty member here at the DCRI.
Thanks, Emily. Today's fascinating conversation features our colleague, Dr. Jennifer Green. She's a board-certified endocrinologist, professor of medicine here at Duke, and a DCRI faculty member. We'll explore what the future might hold for the GLP-1 landscape and what we are still learning. Jennifer, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
As we sort of touched on in our first couple of episodes of this three-part series, this is a field that's changed enormously since the GLP-1s like Ozempic entered the conversation. Can you tell us a little bit about the work you've done and how it's evolved since these medications came onto the scene?
Yes, I agree that there has been a lot of change. So I'm an endocrinologist. I have been involved in research, particularly clinical trials, I would say ever since the start of my career. And I have a particular interest in interventions to reduce the risk of diabetes-related complications. So in particular, cardiovascular and kidney complications. And the field has evolved tremendously from a point where endocrinologists were really focused primarily on management of glucose to reduce the risk of diabetes-related complications. But obviously, we've come a tremendously long way, and there's great potential, I think, particularly with the development of these newer classes of medicines, to enhance the health and prolong the lives of people affected by diabetes, particularly type 2 diabetes.
Jennifer, this is a great place to start because I think it's a topic that feels really dominant in this space, the cardiometabolic space today. So we've all heard of the drugs that you've mentioned, semaglutide, tirzepatide, others that are available and more that are coming down the pipe. Tell us a little bit about the hype. We talked on a prior episode with Neha Piketty-Patti, who you know, about how we often get excited about new medicines as researchers, scientists, clinicians, and that sometimes it's hard to convince people to take them because they're concerned about side effects or whatever. This does not seem to be the case with these new medications. So tell us, what is the hype about? What are these drugs actually doing in the body, and why are they such a big deal both to clinicians as well as to patients?
You're right. This is one situation where patients often come to clinic asking to be started on these newer medications. And really the classes that we're talking about are those that are based upon GLP-1. And just to provide a little bit of frame of reference, GLP-1 is a naturally occurring hormone in the body that is released from the small intestine very soon after we start to eat. And its job is to tell our pancreas, essentially that food's coming. And it's a signal to our pancreas to produce more insulin, less glucagon. Those are effects that help keep our blood sugar from rising very high after meals. Also, there are effects on the stomach and in the brain to make us feel more full so that we don't eat more than our body really needs. So these are all really very beneficial effects in the body. But unfortunately, particularly in people with type 2 diabetes, those effects are not normal. They're blunted. We don't really know if it's because the levels of the hormone are too low or we're just resistant to its effects once we develop diabetes. So for example, semaglutide is a drug that mimics the effect of our body's own GLP-1 directly at the receptor for the hormone, but it's really stimulating the receptors in a way much greater than our bodies would ordinarily. There are other drugs in these classes that are related to, though. For example, tirzepatide is actually a dual incretin agonist. So in addition to providing the same kind of effects that semaglutide does, because it works on the GLP-1 receptor, it stimulates another incretin hormone receptor, the GIP receptor as well. So these classes of drugs are really a very dynamic space. There are new types of drugs and combinations of these kinds of receptor agonists and antagonists that are in the works, and we're learning more and more about their effects all the time.
Jennifer, one of the really interesting things about GLP-1s is we're learning more about that pathway, and it was only after they were on the market for several years and we got longer-acting versions of them that we started thinking about that they may have other opportunities for us, including weight loss. And so, it's quite interesting that both there's this new pathway that was initially for, let's say, diabetic management, but they have anti-inflammatory effects. They might work in T cells. They're doing lots of other things we may not fully understand.
You're absolutely right. So I think these were first thought of and developed to be drugs to lower glucose in people with diabetes, because that intuitively makes a lot of sense when you think about how these incretin hormones work in the body. But they probably do much, much more than that. And again, I think the fact that taking these medicines makes people feel more satisfied and less hungry is very important, because they, in many people, if not the majority of people who take these medicines, can result in weight loss. As a result of weight loss, lots of other risk factors for cardiovascular, kidney, and other complications probably get better too in most people. So lipids, blood pressure, for example, those we tend to see overall improvements in those levels, those risk factors. So there are probably both direct and indirect effects of taking these medicines that provide a beneficial cardiorenal effect and can probably reduce the risk of fatty deposition in the liver and metabolic dysfunction associated liver disease. I mean, there are almost too many areas to mention, but I have to say, I don't think we understand fully how these benefits are derived or provided through use of these medicines. So there's a lot of interest, for example, in whether or not these medicines can reduce both systemic and organ-specific inflammation. And those are parameters and effects that are a little bit more difficult to measure, for example, in a patient in clinic or even in a clinical trial. So they're a bit theoretical at present, but there are probably very widespread physiologic effects of taking these medicines that essentially can make people healthier over the long run.
I'd love to talk more specifically about one of those that's getting some attention in the news. And I think of starting in the diabetes space and moving to cardiovascular disease prevention. Maybe that's moving from one town to like the next door town. I want to talk about moving from like a state on the East Coast to what I feel is like a state on the West Coast, which is like using these drugs for something like addiction. So one of the more interesting things that I've read about these therapies actually is an anecdote that came from a Reddit thread, a gentleman who said, I struggled with a gambling addiction and started taking one of these medications for something completely different, for obesity-related risk. And all of a sudden, I noticed that my urges to gamble had gone down, and the medications are expensive, but I justify my continued use because I'm saving so much money on not gambling as much anymore. What do we know about how this might work, either biologically or behaviorally?
That's a great question, too. And I think that much of this was prompted by these anecdotal reports where people were taking these medicines for other reasons and found that their urge to smoke or to drink alcohol or to gamble was lessened as well, which is an unexpected, but generally a very positive side effect of taking the medications. So we do know that there are GLP-1 receptors present in areas of the brain that are involved with reward and addiction. And this is not my area of expertise. However, it is postulated that stimulating the GLP-1 receptors actually lessens the release of dopamine in response to a behavior such as drinking or smoking or gambling or compulsive shopping, for example, so that the reward related to partaking in those behaviors is less. So there's less of a motivation, there's less of an incentive to participate in those behaviors because essentially the reward, the physiologic reward that you get from doing it is less. And so that's what's theorized. And I have to say that for many people, actually eating may result in that kind of a reward behavior too. So maybe that's part of why people feel more satiated when they're taking these classes of medications. But in any event, there's a lot to learn. I think that these are side effects that in general would be considered favorable effects of taking the medicines. We're not anywhere near yet prescribing these medicines specifically to treat or lessen addictive type behaviors. There are small studies that have been conducted, but it's very early days and we have a lot to learn.
One thing that strikes me, Jennifer, is that we discover more and more potential applications for these drugs. That translates into a bigger chunk of the population that potentially might benefit from them. And we've seen in early studies that once you stop taking these drugs, there may be some long-term benefits. But in general, we see patients returning to close to their baseline. What are the long-term implications for this population of patients that may be prescribed GLP-1? What are other options?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts about that. And this is really sort of the million-dollar question, right? So people often are a little reluctant to start these medicines, even if they're very clearly indicated and would be beneficial to them, because they don't like the idea of being on a medicine forever. Now, before I talk about the other options for use of these medicines, I'm just going to preface them by saying, we give a lot of medicines indefinitely for chronic medical conditions like hypertension, dyslipidemia, certainly diabetes. These are going to be lifelong issues, and they very well may require lifelong treatments. Some of this will require a change in our perspective. However, this, of course, is a burning question. And in general, when you look at what happens in clinical trials if people stop taking the GLP-1 receptor agonist or dual incretin agonist that they've been on compared to staying on it, they regain weight. And when you look at the trials that have been performed so far, the amount of weight that you regain seems to be fairly proportionate to the amount that you lost. So if you had lost 15% of your body weight when taking a medicine, you're going to regain a very significant percentage of body weight once you're off of it. But that is the average or general response to withdrawal of the medication. So there are some people, probably a small number of people in these trials, who successfully kept the weight off. We do need to learn more about those people. Maybe we can generate some sort of a clinical phenotype or use biomarkers to predict which people might be able to successfully stop the medicine or maybe take it only intermittently. At present, I can't predict who that person will be, but there are other options to consider. I mean, of course, we want to encourage appropriate lifestyle modification if people were to stop the medications. That has had sort of variable success in clinical trials so far, but you might consider in someone who has reached their target weight, either reducing the dose of the GLP-1 receptor agonist or maybe switching them to a different class of medication that's indicated for weight management that isn't quite as potent, for example. A not unreasonable thing to consider would be something like a metabolic surgery, a gastric sleeve procedure, or even there is a duodenal mucosal resurfacing procedure that's being studied in people who took the dual incretin agonist tirzepatide, lost a lot of weight on it, and then they're being randomized to stop the medicine and either get this resurfacing procedure or not get the resurfacing procedure, because it's very appealing to think about having a one-time procedure that would allow you to just keep the weight that you've successfully lost off. But of course, those studies are ongoing. We don't know if that will be a successful approach yet.
It's one of those areas where the science is so compelling. It's almost like it opens up truly like a lifetime of additional science to better understand things like the mechanisms, cessation, if that's sort of the patient preference. What happens if somebody does stay on it for, decades because, they're new enough that we don't know the answer to that either. So it must be a super exciting time for you, first of all, watching all of this take place, but then also getting to be part of the research yourself. So the pipeline, I think it's fair to say, is like on fire, right? We have an oral version of these medications coming out, some new combinations that people have talked about. What kinds of breakthroughs do you think we'll be hearing about in the next few years? Do you think it'll be more options within this class for the same kind of indication? Do you think it'll be targeted options for specific groups of people? You think it'll focus more on like the maintenance and long-term aspect or some combination?
It's a very dynamic area. some of the areas that are pretty hot, either based upon what's in development or some of the challenges that remain to use of the drugs that we even have available at present would be, for example, the bioavailability of these medications. Traditionally, they've been peptides. They're difficult to produce. You have to give them at very high doses to achieve adequate blood levels, to achieve the desired clinical response. I mean, there are a number of small molecules in development that are designed to stimulate the GLP-1 receptors. There are, for example, some pancreatic gene therapies that are in development that could enhance the activity of the GLP-1 response in the body. So there are lots of people thinking about how to stimulate a GLP-1 type response better, more efficiently. But the combinations of GLP-1 receptor agonists with lots of other types of activities in the body, I think, is going to be tremendously interesting. So looking at medicines that, for example, stimulate the GIP receptor, stimulate the glucagon receptor, these are all drugs that appear to have tremendous potential in helping people to lose weight, and we think in turn to also result in cardiovascular and organ-specific protection. Some of the challenges, I think, are things like what happens to body composition if someone loses 25% of their body weight on a medicine like this. There's a bit of conflicting data available at present that suggests that sometimes the amount of lean muscle mass or lean body weight that's lost is maybe a bit more than we see with, for example, metabolic surgery procedures. And of course, there are the ever-present issues related to cost and access. And so those are not resolved. So these are areas that I think we need to concentrate on and really think about moving forward so that when we have these even more powerful tools available for clinical use, we are using them to our patients' best advantage.
This is Beyond the Endpoint, a podcast where we bring personal and expert perspectives on healthcare and clinical research to the casual listener. Stay tuned after the interview for a breakdown with the hosts. They'll talk through key takeaways and what this week's topic means for you.
Jennifer, you've described so many unanswered questions in this space, which I think are all like super active areas of research from what I can tell. Tell me how you sort of frame this with just sort of the average patient in clinic, that we have some very strong data that shows that, yes, this medication is effective and safe, for this particular purpose or population, but there's so much we don't know. Are you seeing concerns come up? And part of the reason I'm asking is it's been interesting to see over the past few years that some of the discussion and sort of controversy around misinformation is that some folks feel that, what we said about COVID, for example, as a scientific community evolved with time. We see that as a good thing because we're learning and adapting and refining what we know. People outside of the scientific community, I think, have sometimes seen that as undermining the sort of the veracity or the validity of what was said at the beginning, right? I'd be so curious to know if people have come to you with these questions of like, how do we even know much about these things? They're so new. And how do you frame that uncertainty with the really great data that shows that these can be very helpful?
It does take some time and a bit of a conversation when you are talking with a patient about first starting a medication like this. Now, the question, what do we know about these medicines over the long term, for example, I actually think is fairly easy to answer because personally, I feel that we know far more about the effects of these medicines than many of the drugs that have been used, for example, for diabetes management for decades. So actually, I feel very confident that these drugs have been studied in thousands of people at high risk for adverse outcomes, and that we have a pretty good feeling for what the likely risks and benefits associated with use of these drugs is likely to be. Now, of course, we can't predict everything that might occur, but I do feel very comfortable conveying my thoughts and perspective to patients when we're talking about starting the medications. Now, I think what we're starting to see in social media, for example, is a bit of concern being expressed about the side effects of the medicines that we know are likely to occur and likely to occur if the drugs are not prescribed carefully. And so at least 25% of people who start a GLP-1 receptor agonist, or for example, tirzepatide, a dual incretin agonist, will have some degree of GI upset. Most commonly, it would be nausea. Occasionally, it is emesis or vomiting as well. Some people have loose stools, or some people are constipated. There's no way to predict in advance who will experience those side effects. But I am very careful, first of all, to make sure that the person starting the medicine is aware that that might occur. Because if I send someone home with a prescription for a medicine and they suddenly become nauseated and vomit, that's going to be a very poor experience for them. And in fact, they might never take the medicine again, even if they have a clear indication for it. And unfortunately, I think that happens very often. I think it's important to make sure that when you start someone on a given dose, that they're feeling well, that they're not experiencing significant GI upset before you titrate the dose up further. I don't think that necessarily is happening consistently in general use. And so people can become very ill. People can become so ill and dehydrated that they need to be hospitalized. So a lot of what you hear in social media is focused on those kinds of side effects, and they are happening. So is reflective of some people's experience. But I think we need to remember these are very powerful tools. I always recommend starting low and going slow because each individual will have, I think, often a unique response to starting these medicines. The other thing, too, from an endocrinologist perspective is these drugs accomplish so much with respect to glucose lowering in particular that often I need to decrease the doses of the other medicines that they're taking. Their insulin doses, for example, to make sure that we can continue to up-titrate the dose of the GLP-1 receptor agonist safely. So there are a lot of moving parts. I think when someone's thinking about or has started these medications that with careful medical supervision generally goes very smoothly. But unfortunately, I don't think that's always happening. People get really excited about starting these medicines. They want to see results quickly. I think, unfortunately, that's a recipe for a bad outcome.
Jennifer, that's really helpful. From my perspective as a cardiologist, if our concept of lipids has changed, it's not just one component, it's multiple components. And what we thought about fat has changed. And, what we thought about it in the 60s and 70s versus what we think about that for heart disease has changed. And I think that's what's gone on with diabetes, where it was glucose management above all. And that is important, but what we've learned is it's maybe not glucose management above all else. It may be how you manage it, because these therapeutics have so many other effects that could be so beneficial to people, not the least of which might be losing weight and feeling better about themselves and being more active. So as we look forward, what do you think are the big steps that will happen, not just, I guess, in the diabetic space, but in these classes of medications? Can one see them becoming a backbone for all kinds of other preventive therapy? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that front.
Yeah, first, I personally think of use of these new medicines as a tremendous opportunity. And I hope that thinking about using these new classes feels like an opportunity rather than a burden to the average provider who's out there taking care of people with diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease. Because in my experience, using these medicines can actually allow you oftentimes to take people off other medicines that potentially they don't tolerate well, that are less safe, and that don't have an outcomes benefit. So I hope that there is a shift in perspective to embrace these new medicines and really think about them in a different way than I think we traditionally have. I like to think each time a new trial comes out that shows, for example, that a GLP-1 receptor agonist improves outcomes in people with type 2 diabetes and chronic kidney disease, well, you know what? I already had my patient on that medicine because they had type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and I can just give myself a pat on the back and say, well, I was doing good things for their kidneys already, It just wasn't proven yet. So I think we really need to consider and take advantage of what seem to be the widely pleiotropic effects of these classes of medications. Some of it's through glucose lowering, some of it's through weight loss, but probably a good bit of it isn't. And once we recognize this, I think we can introduce these drugs probably at earlier and earlier stages to improve health outcomes in ever broader populations. So, it's not always easy to justify the upfront cost of the expenditure on the medication itself. But if we can keep people out of the hospital, if we can reduce their need for interventional procedures, their need for organ transplantations, improve their quality of life, these are medications that very likely are worth the investment.
I know this is a little bit outside of the topics that we've covered today, but you did mention costs. So I got to ask, let's say in 5 years, all of the cost and access issues with these medicines have been solved. Will this be due to A, an executive order that caps drug prices, B, competition from new therapies that lower the prices sort of across the board, C, compounding pharmacies, generics, something along those lines, or maybe something else? What do you think?
Well, my preference would be B, that there are so many options available and that some company or multiple companies have decided to be as competitive as possible in the space by making their drugs available at lower cost. That would be my preference. But honestly, I probably wouldn't argue with the end result of any of those interventions.
We'll take what we can get, right?
I think it's a great question, Emily. Our history is that I think this gets resolved, and I think it will get resolved because the need for our health and the cost is so great. And the disparity in the cost, both to the people in the United States but around the world, is great. And so I do think that this will get resolved, but I don't know that an executive order will happen. I don't think that competition will do it because we've had competition for therapeutics for a very long time. And competition just means more therapeutics come out. But unless there's something else, they can still price themselves like they're just close to their other competition and make it complicated for us to get it to our patients. I think what's happening with GLP-1 receptor agonists and others in the space, which is quite unique, is it's one of the first therapies where 100% of employee benefits of state Medicaids are seeing that these patients, these people, there's so many that are eligible, need the access to the therapy. So when you get a therapy that is going to affect such a large amount of the population, I believe now that the employee and the financial innovation to get this closer to our patients is going to happen.
That assumes some level of functionality in our political system, Manesh, which we'll save that for another episode.
I think I agree with you. This is a good conversation, but I don't know that it's a political system as much as I think the dollars will drive it, because if you're an employer and you had a lower cost option for your employees to get GLP-1 receptor agonists than what's present now, you will go towards that. And I think that's where the competition happens, because a lot of this price is being driven between the producer and the delivery of these drugs. And I think it won't take away all of the cost needs, but it will take away a certain number. But again, it's just a thought. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us. We really enjoyed the conversation. You can tell it fired us up on how to get these therapies to our patients.
Thank you so much. This was a terrific conversation.
Well, Emily, I'll start by saying I'm not an easily excitable guy. Usually it takes me a while to think about these drugs really making a difference. And I've seen lots of therapies come and go. And so I'll just say that I am generally quite excited about these. And the reason is I actually think they're going to make a difference potentially in so many people's lives. But I think we have so much more to learn. And what do I mean by that? First, people with diabetes actually lose less weight than people who don't have diabetes, even though they started with diabetes. There's some science there we still got to figure out. The second is people start having benefits for their heart in large studies before they've lost significant weight. So these are often thought as weight loss drugs. I think they're actually probably anti-inflammatory and then hormonal drugs working in the gut-brain axis. And then lastly, if they bind, T cells and the receptors, not just in our brain and other places, we're going to learn about scientific ways in which not just this class, but other classes might make us change how we think about the biology. So I'm excited, one, because of just the data we have to date, but really it's going to open up new pathways that we haven't thought about.
It was so interesting to hear that same sort of perspective from Jennifer. I would say she's probably also one who's not easily excited and really is a show me the evidence kind of gal, which is why we love her. That's our vibe here. But she also seemed super enthusiastic again about some of these sort of psychological and neurological benefits. But I got to say, what a weird time to be sort of trying to consume all of this evidence, integrate it into practice, and then deal with the landscape of misinformation and, I would say, general suspicion of therapies that are regulated by the FDA and produced by pharmaceutical companies. And so we spent a little bit of time talking about those challenges, but I imagine this is just another example of the science really evolving in sort of the behavioral space and thinking about not just the sort of dry clinical factors that might influence why somebody chooses a medication, but really how they're approaching this from the perspective of a normal person who just wants to know what evidence is there, what evidence is not, and how they can make a decision given that this is still a really evolving field. I'm curious to hear how you've dealt with this. People who come to you and say, hey, I know there's some data, but like we're using this drug in so many people, and is it really as safe as they say? Do we really think that it benefits all of these different dimensions?
Let me start by saying, first, full disclosure, I haven't recently conducted any trials in GLP-1s, but I conduct trials in cardiovascular medicine. So I've done trials for antithrombotics, drugs to make you clot less. We're doing trials, and I've done trials in anti-lipid, things that make your arteries plaque less, or at least say have less blockage. As a day-to-day practitioner, I try to put mechanical devices sometimes in those arteries to open them up. Why is this class so interesting to me? I would say if you haven't read Eric Topol's Super Agers, I would. I mean, I think that is a book that will help us think about where, not just this therapy, but where we're going and what's the science of healthy aging, the best available science. Obviously, there's, as you just said, a lot of theories. The reason I think this is really important is there's a concept that I'm thinking more and more about as I think about aging, which is there's an ability to prevent heart disease, but I think there's an ability to prevent neurodegenerative disease, and there's an ability to prevent cancer. And we usually don't talk about the other two in this fashion. And these therapeutics and these biologic pathways are showing us that in addition to exercise, and I'll call it lifestyle, as Eric calls it, lifestyle plus, there's a concept that there's a biologic clock and a chronologic clock. And we all would love to figure out where our biologic clock is compared to, I'll call it age, which is just a number. These therapeutics are showing us that they can reduce some of those constant processes like inflammation, some of the other risk factors that in the long term, if we can follow patients long enough, I think will show benefits. So I say that not just for GLP-1s, I say that for the scientific field, where I think the way to get the best information we can to people is if they want to play in this space, which is an important space. How do I stay healthy as long as I can and have the youngest biologic clock I could, is to lean in and say, okay, what would those things be? They're likely going to be things around how does your DNA work? How do the cells work? How does inflammation work? How does that lead to you functionally being able to exercise and stay healthy and not have these events? Here's the data along that pathway that works for one individual, and that's what it looks like at a population level. So I'm excited about our series because we've delved into it. And I think for many more in this podcast, and please click on the podcast and follow us, we want you to know that this is one of the things that we're going to spend some time doing.
I'll just say, so often we like to live in our silos. And one of the cool things about the research in this space is that you really do see the convergence of expertise in cardiology, endocrinology, aging, prevention. It's just I think, a really gratifying movement from I only deal with the heart or only deal with the brain, only deal with the kidneys to there are connections there. And we're starting to understand those connections better. And we're starting to see medications that can work on pathways across those dimensions. And I think that's what's so cool about also the multidisciplinary approach that we take to research at the DCRI to not just get the cardiology perspective, but also the pop health perspective, the stats perspective, the endocrine perspective, and really try to design work in a way that really reflects all of those factors. So I don't know, maybe one day we won't even have cardiologists. Maybe everybody will just be a cardiometabolic disorder specialist.
Yeah, no, listen, I've said to people, and I don't say this lightly, I want to put myself out of business. I wish there's a world in which you don't need cardiologists and people are healthier. The reason most of us wake up and come to the DCRI or work at academic institutions, which is lost, I think, sometimes in the conversation in the country right now, which is We do that because we're challenged to think and work and discover and hopefully deliver better health. We do it because people like you or people like the people we've had on this podcast or others will have, Jennifer Green, Neha, they push us to think differently. And that's why you do it, because that's the exciting part about being in any field, is that you want to grow and learn. And hopefully you guys are getting a sense of that, because the opportunity for us to really make an impact on health isn't to sit in our silos in an academic institution. It's to be in the clinics. It's to see our patients. It's to study and work with people who think about science in a different way to get to those rural communities. And hopefully you get a sense of that as you think about what the Duke Clinical Research Institute's doing, but what the whole country's trying to do as we think about science and evidence and improving health. And I'll just end with this sort of quip, right? I get more and more interesting in aging the older I get. And so like another thing that happens is every one of us starts to think about our health and go, you know what? I should probably figure out what this whole thing is. But anyway, Emily, this has been fun. It's been a great 3-part episode. And I really think Jennifer Green's episode here really helped us. And I'll say to our audience, thanks for joining us for this episode of Beyond the Endpoint. As always, please reach out with your thoughts or topic recommendations at beyondtheendpoint@duke.edu. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast and connect with the Duke Clinical Research Institute on LinkedIn and at DCRI News on X and Blue Sky.
This has been Beyond the Endpoint. Resources related to this episode are available on dcri.org/BTE. If you have any burning questions about clinical research or healthcare, drop us a line at beyondtheendpoint@duke.edu. We'd love to address your questions in a future episode.